Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. It's been a minute since I put out a new episode, and it's just been a very busy summer for me, and I think I'm finally coming out of the fog of that. And I'm really excited today to have Vince and Geoff Graham on the show. Brothers, people I've known for a little bit. I've known Vince longer than Geoff. But we're gonna get into some wonky stuff today that I personally find very interesting. But before I do that, I just want to say welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining me.
Love being here, Kevin. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Kevin.
Well, it's great to see you both. Vince, I have known for a little bit longer. Of the two brothers, that Vince is been in the new urbanist development world a long time, along with his brother, but I just knew Vince from years ago. Also very involved in a couple of what I consider to be the most beautiful new projects that have been built under the new urbanist banner in South Carolina, and with their father, Tom. Geoff, who I've gotten to know more recently, also involved in all of the same. But Geoff has a podcast called Yeoman, which is one of my favorite listens. Always a lot of great conversations on there. Geoff's had me on there, and he's had a lot of other folks as well. For anybody listening, I would say also the conversation that the two of you had with your dad was terrific. I really, really enjoyed hearing all of that. I must have been interesting and fun for both of you to do as well.
Love doing that. I did that back to back with Vince. And that was shortly before he passed away, which was suddenly and unexpectedly. And so it was a great thing to have done. If anybody's interested in the meandering career of I call it a wildcat Yeoman real estate developer. Or like that episode on Yeoman is Tom Graham. I recommend it. It's a fun story about entrepreneurship, as well as sort of, growing up in a modernizing South and urbanism as well.
Yeah. Well, today I reached out to Geoff and to Vince because I think like a lot of people in this world of urbanism, which touches planning and transportation and so many other things, real estate development, we have an endless amount of conversations about like infrastructure and the planning, designing, financing, building of infrastructure. And I frequently have conversations with a lot of really thoughtful people on this topic who know the ins and outs and are frustrated with how we build things today. But it also seems like we have a hard time getting past some sort of simple solutions, like if we just had better people in charge, if we just had some simple, clear rules, that the way we do things today would work just fine. And I think both of you know from conversations we've had in the past, I'm more interested in like the historical trajectory of how we have changed doing things in our country. So I'll draw a parallel a little bit to planning and development in the sense that planning and development, for most of our country's first 150 years, we were able to do that without much of an administrative state at all. And we built some remarkable some of the most remarkable communities in the country that way. And then we introduced zoning and the city planning apparatus starting in the 19-teens and 20s. And the system we have today largely is a child of that. Infrastructure as we know it and build it and finance it today also went through a transformation in about the same era that I just don't think many people are as aware of. I'm certainly not terribly aware of it. Geoff has turned me on a little bit to a Supreme Court case called Wilson versus Shaw that I've learned a little bit about that was influential in the same way that Euclid v. Ambler was influential in the zoning world. And I wondered if we could just have a little conversation today. Geoff and Vince, in addition to what they have done as developers, are tremendous historians and have a breadth of knowledge on all this that I think is incredibly useful. So I think from there, I'd kind of like to take it from there and just talk a little bit, whoever wants to take it first, about helping trace a little bit of the history of how we do things today and maybe how differently that might have been 150 years ago when we were still building infrastructure and building cities.
Vince, can I let you start there?
Yeah, I apologize. I had to move locations. I was having a challenging connection with Wi-Fi. And I didn't hear the last bit of what you said, Kevin. So if you wouldn't mind repeating that. Yeah, I heard you say Wilson v. Shaw, but that's...
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll tee it up a little bit and Vince can jump in there. As you say, Kevin, we built remarkably beautiful, I would say world-class places in the early part of our history. And then that began to change in the early part of the 1900s. You referenced the Euclid decision of 1926, which is a really important one. And you also alluded to a Supreme Court decision, 1907 decision, that changed the way infrastructure got funded in the United States. And it's really a sea change to how we approach financing and building infrastructure. And when people are talking about our urbanism, I think a criticism I often have of the new urbanists for all the great work they've done is I think they underemphasize the manner in which things get paid for and how those decisions get made. And it's really hard to think about I think it's an incomplete picture of our built environment. And we just think about the buildings and the streets they face and where they come from without thinking about how those things, particularly infrastructure, gets paid for and how that funding, both for construction and maintenance, impacts the whole world. Vince he's written a lot about this topic, probably less on social media, but more about the history of that funding. And I'll probably kind of having teed it up there, Vince, let me hand it to you to run with that.
Okay. Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, it's Geoff laid it out pretty well that we don't really, when we build these kind of places or we study the built environment, the streets, the architecture, but the funding is a little more abstract and not well known. We, having been involved in a number of projects, including ION, are very knowledgeable about that funding. Where do you get the money to build streets and sidewalks and utility lines, water and sewer and parks. And so when we look at history, I mean, what questions that come up to me are, why in a period when where people are much less affluent than we are today, how did we manage to build such fantastic places? And also why, given all our affluence today, do we tend to just build places that are so disappointing. And as Geoff said, if you look back at that, that was a landmark decision, a little known landmark decision in 1907 that arose from an individual named Warren Wilson from a small town outside Chicago, Hinsdale, I believe, who sued the Secretary of the Treasury, Leslie Shaw, over funding of the Panama Canal. And he maintained, and I agree, that funding was unconstitutional. And so my basis for that is looking back to the framers of the Constitution. And in the closing hours of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, Ben Franklin proposed that Congress be empowered to fund canals. And so Roger Sherman, who was one of the delegates from Connecticut, said, if you were to do that, then the cost would fall on the United States and the benefit accrue to the place where the canals could be cut. So in other words, not a good idea to tax the many for the benefit of the few. And the framers debated this and ultimately voted 8-3 against Franklin's proposal. And so that was not one of Congress's powers. You couldn't fund canals or any infrastructure. It continued to be fought about in Congress over the subsequent decades. Between 1817, James Madison's last act as president was to veto a bill that would have gone to fund infrastructure. And that was the first of 20 such vetoes by 5 other presidents leading up to Buchanan was the last one who vetoed a couple bills. And so that was just kind of the way it was. The Congress simply did not have the power to fund infrastructure.
And the veto, the presidents explained their vetoes, and it was not like, I don't like this, I don't like the idea or not. It was, the Constitution doesn't allow for this. I'm vetoing it because I take my oath of office seriously. And if you want the federal government to be empowered to fund internal improvements, we need to amend the Constitution. And that was just not politically possible. So they kept getting vetoed. You can probably imagine the setting, though. Like, there were a lot of financial interests, railroad industry. There's actually in the latter part of the 1800s, big bicycle was a thing. They wanted the federal government truly, this is a real thing. They wanted the federal government to get involved with paving roads because that would be really good for bicycle travel. So there's a lot of pressure to find other people's money to fund infrastructure for specific places. Real estate developers, real estate speculators, all those sorts of things. So Vince, I'm interjecting on you, but kind of carry forward from there.
No, that's right. Just to continue and expand Geoff's point, these presidents not only said, some of them said they just are vetoing because it's not within the constitutional, it's not within Congress's power. But several of them expanded on that point to say why it was such a bad idea. And the concern is that would lead to this kind of conflicts between states and this kind of undesirable, contest to see who could get the most money for their state. And that could lead to disunion, which that was another little known fact, but that was one of the big issues that preceded the Civil War. The Republicans wanted the ability to fund infrastructure to benefit industry. The South did not want that at all. And if you can just read through the Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, and see how they made changes to the Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, to make it very clear that in no way could the central government fund infrastructure. But if your listeners would like to know more about that, you can look up, an especially good one is James Polk's. He had 2 vetoes, but his second veto of an infrastructure bill goes into the deep history of this and why it's a bad idea for Congress to do this. But a number of others, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Franklin, Buchanan, as I mentioned, there were these, legal opinions and long discourses on why this was a bad idea. So anyway, back to Wilson v. Shaw, the court ruled that the court granted Congress this power. So they basically issued this, extra constitutional ruling that just dismissed the framers and all these opinions of previous presidents. So why that matters, it ultimately led to the first federal aid highway bill in 1916. So about 9 years later, preceding that was the Federal Reserve Act and the Internal Revenue Act of 1913 that gave Congress, the federal government, vast new sources of funding for projects like, dams and roads and wars and things like that, which heretofore they did not have. So this occurred at the same time that the automobile was coming into its own. And people were clamoring for more streets, and you had your big industrialists, Henry Ford and Firestone and others who were agitating and lobbying for more federal funding of infrastructure, particularly or especially automotive infrastructure. Cars doesn't work that well unless you have a road to drive on. And it's also interesting, prior, if you think about a railroad train or a streetcar system, those were privately developed and operated. Those companies had to actually incur the cost and of development and maintenance of those roads upon which, or in other words, the hardware upon which the software would run. With automobile infrastructure, they got the government to do that, and they especially got the state and federal government to do that.
Yeah, I think to me, it's always been one of the most interesting little known facts about our history that for many, many decades, public transportation, as we would call it today, they were actually private companies that were for-profit enterprises. And sometimes, many times they probably had to get an agreement with the governing agency to operate within the right-of-way. But they, as you mentioned, they had to build and maintain all their own infrastructure and provide the service. And obviously they had to run it at a profit as well, or they wouldn't be able to continue to operate.
It's worth adding that was in a period of time where our trolley and passenger rail system were the greatest in the world.
Right.
We shouldn't forget that America has had, despite what we have now, it was a time in the not distant past, our great grandparents would have remembered this time where we had the greatest, trolley and rail system in the world.
Yeah.
A note I'd add about that Supreme Court decision, and I think we should get into people instinctively are like, well, this infrastructure is good. It's good for us to how would the infrastructure get done, or it's good for us to have that. And I think it's important for us to talk about how the dynamic of federal funding and particularly debt financing has changed the way infrastructure works. But I do want to say something about the Supreme Court of that era. This was an era these justices were very much of the progressive era, and the prevailing legal mentality of the time was different than it had been before, these were justices who had come through the enormous pain and dislocation of the Civil War. Everybody knew their whole worldview about just humanity had changed, and they were no longer the justices were no longer as passionately deferential to the founders as they thought about law. And so they had a much more malleable interpretation of precedent, and they favored in their decisions during this era the general sentiment of the time. And so they were certainly not originalists, as we would call them today, but they were of a time like, it's a new era. People feel differently about things. They're much more kind of democratic populist about what the law is. And so they're like, a lot of people really like the idea of the federal government funding internal improvements, and people like bicycles, and these cars look kind of cool. So, it's probably okay if the federal government gets involved with that because people want it. And that's sort of how they were more inclined, and I'm oversimplifying, I'm sure, but they were more inclined to make their decisions, render their opinions that way rather than on sort of a strict legal basis and sort of what did the founders want. So the opinions Vince described from Polk or Madison or Jackson, whoever they were, or prior Supreme Court justices' Supreme Court opinions, that was not a big deal to them. It was a new era. This is a new time, and we had to make decisions differently, or so they would argue. The downstream effects of those have been enormous. We're now in a position where, as Vince said, and the founders predicted would happen, you have states clamoring to get funds from the federal government to pay for their infrastructure in their places, so they get matching dollars or direct funding from the federal government to build their infrastructure. And so there's far and far less regard for the return on investment of the infrastructure, the efficiency of it, and it's much and there's a lot of incentive for the cost to go up. So we overspend on infrastructure that doesn't produce a return. And then, as I think the Strong Towns people have done, Chuck Marone and that whole organization has done a great job highlighting, it's negative ROI. Like the maintenance, the user fees, whether gas taxes or the other user fees, it doesn't cover the maintenance for that infrastructure. And so we're debt financing via federal debt, funding for infrastructure that doesn't pencil, and it doesn't cover its own nut, in order to make it easier for the people of today, theoretically easier, though it doesn't in practice work that way, to drive their car around. And like Vince says, it's like the federal government with our public debt, is paying for the hardware that the software of the automobile runs on and has private benefit for.
And I might add one thing to that too, is that I think a lot of people aren't even aware how much of a localized infrastructure comes, at least some portion of it is financed through federal transportation dollars. Because we think about federal dollars and we think about interstate highways, major transnational projects. But when you get involved in things like metropolitan planning organizations and you see how transportation funding flows from the federal government to the states or to the regional governments, it's interesting how much you learn that there's often fairly sizable chunks of arterial street networks in cities that have at least some federal funding attached to it, if not completely federally funded. And then therefore have to meet federal guidelines for contracting, for construction, design, et cetera, which has been a big leverage point for the federal government in many different administrations trying to push whatever they think is the right idea at the time. So I think in a lot of ways, this is not like a really abstract. There's probably more federal influence on some of your local roadways than most people realize.
Huge. Yeah, and beyond the direct dollars too, you had a long period of time where for housing financing, to qualify for financing, your infrastructure development in your municipality or the neighborhood you were developing had to match federally prescribed standards, which favored auto dependency as well. So even if there wasn't direct dollars going to promote the redevelopment of our cities toward auto dependency, there was indirect incentive there to qualify so that homeowners could qualify for federal financing for their or development dollars.
Yeah.
It's it's sort of the length, the amount of legislation that directly or indirectly externalizes the costs of auto dependency from the individual themselves or the auto manufacturer, people who profit from it, that push those costs out to society, and in particular the future via debt, like our great-grandchildren. It's a near infinite long list.
Right.
Truly insidious.
Vince, for a time, you were on, I think, South Carolina's, Transportation Commission or Department of Transportation Board? You can correct me on the exact title. I'm curious what you saw and, being more directly involved in a state agency like that and how it might have shaped some of how you look at this issue.
Well, yeah, I served as chairman of the South Carolina Transportation Infrastructure Bank,
okay,
which was not really a bank. It was more like a grant-making slush fund that was set up originally to fund some big projects in South Carolina, including the Ravenel Bridge over the Cooper River in Charleston, and then just kind of stayed around, and politicians use it to help fund their favorite projects. And I imagine I was appointed by Governor Haley, and then when she was appointed to be the ambassador of the United Nations, I was quickly replaced because I wasn't kind of going along with the whole scheme. So I went back to a job which paid. But it was an interesting thing that to see it from the inside. And, there's some really good people in that state government and the State Department of Transportation. There's no vision, and the local decision making, that is the state and even the county and the municipality, is so distorted by the system. If they can get federal dollars, why not get them and keep building highways out into the countryside? One of the things I learned while there was that I knew that South Carolina has the fourth largest system of any DOT in the country.
Really?
It's Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina.
Wow.
Even though South Carolina is a relatively small state.
Right. Yeah.
And Texas is so big, as you might imagine. It's a really big state. What I learned is, in my position as chair, that the reason South Carolina's is so big, and as well as that of the mileage in the Virginia and North Carolina systems, is because in the 40s and 50s, those three states shared the same New York City-based bond council that was advising the DOTs, or at the time they were called highway departments, to take all the mileage they could into their systems so they could get more federal dollars. Other states didn't do that to the extent, and therefore are more decentralized. But yeah, roughly 60% almost 70% of the mileage in South Carolina is in the state DOT. And on a per acre or per square mile on a per capita basis, South Carolina's is the biggest in the country. So yeah, and just to give you a local example, I'm here in downtown Charleston. Most of the streets in downtown Charleston are in the state DOT system. And that happened in the 40s and 50s. And then in 1960, the city was which was at the time only 3,500 acres. It was just the peninsula. You've been to Charleston. It was just the peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper rivers. So that had been historically the city and within those bounds. And it was, roughly 3,500 acres at the time. But they were bleeding population to these new suburbs. There had been this infrastructure built over the preceding decades, and there was the white flight and all that. So the city was bleeding population, and they saw that. And to recover or save their tax base, they started annexing. And they leaked over the Ashley River in 1960 to grab some of those first ring suburbs. So by the time Joe Riley took office in 1974, the city had grown to about 7,000 acres. And so double the size of its historic peninsula. And I think that Riley and others saw that, hey, we can annex land, but we don't have to be responsible for the infrastructure because the state and the feds will be funding all that and they'll be maintaining that. So they went on this annexation binge. And by the time Riley left office, the city was 72,000 acres. So it was bigger than Washington, D.C. and Boston combined.
Wow.
With a fraction of the population. So back to Geoff's point and emphasis on what, Chuck Marone and others have done is this it doesn't pay. It doesn't pay it for itself, all this infrastructure. So it's just, this is a way it distorts us. Hopefully that's shows an example of how this system distorts land use and transportation and decisions about fiscal policy too. Back in the day, they had to be responsible for if they wanted to annex land, they really had to think carefully about how they were going to fund it.
And there are a great many people, thoughtful people, who would argue it's very good for the federal government to be involved in this. It's very good for them to be able to debt finance internal improvements. Yes, they'd certainly, in the urbanism crowd, they would prefer that funding be pointed in different directions. They would like it rather than it be funded pointed toward infrastructure that promotes auto dependency. They would like, more bike paths or more, a better Amtrak system or whatever it is. My view, I think Vince would agree with this, is that because of the nature of how it's set up, where the money is other people's money, they're spending other people's money on your infrastructure. We create this dynamic that, and it can be debt financed. That we create this dynamic that necessarily it creates an incentive to maximize cost and maximize the amount of work that is done, and just perpetuate on and on and on. It's like Milton Friedman's 4 different ways to spend money. You can spend your money on what you want, and you get exactly what you want. And then he gets through the other ones. And the last one is you can spend other people's money on people you don't know. Mm-hmm. And you're likely to spend way more money and not get them what they want. Mm-hmm. And that's how our infrastructure system is done now. I think in practical terms, a point I make over and over is that because it's set up this way, because every mile driven on, and this is just the federal interstates, and putting aside the tendrils that you described, Kevin, that go off and other things, because every mile that's driven on this road, on our federal roads, the user fees that the person driving on that road, or the trucking company or whatever, the user fees that cover the maintenance, that are intended to cover the maintenance costs for that, they only cover half the maintenance costs. And many states, much less, some states more. California has a huge gas tax, and they're closer to covering the full cost. But the impact of that would have been Jefferson, Madison, others, particularly these anti-federalist crowd, they were very sensitive to this. They saw that the impact of a dynamic like that would destroy localism and destroy local community, because the further a person travels, or the further a good travels, this is really important for commerce, the greater it is federally subsidized. For a piece of produce that's coming from California to South Carolina, 3% of its cost, somewhere between 3 and 4% of its cost, is federally subsidized. And with just the infrastructure portion of it, and people are like, 3 or 4%, that's not a big deal. But I mean, grocery stores are, low single digits for their operating margins. And if you do that, you have that kind of thumb on the scale for over a century, now approaching 150 years, for financing this way. And increasingly, you're going to favor the very distant, large-scale producer over the local, smaller producer, or the local town, or the living close to where you work, all those sorts of things. And you're going to lose your communities. You'll lose your subsidiarity, your local decision-making influence over your local influence over decisions that affect you locally. And you'll lose your regional differences. People become transient. A lot of the things that I think new urbanists want to have will get eroded, and that's a sense of community and attachment to neighbors and belonging and roots and things like that will go away. So this insidious system where we've set up that with debt, we fund we subsidize distant large-scale production to amplify its advantage over local producers and local relationships. It's insidious, and our founders and the people who were objecting to these things for the first 75 years of the country, they very much predicted that that's what would happen if we allowed this kind of thing to happen, and it happened.
Well, I should jump in and just qualify a little bit of that. And again, back to the convention, there was a divide among those, including on one side, you had your Franklin and Madison at the convention, and Washington, all these people who wanted the federal government to be involved, and the smaller states that were jealous of that control of doing it themselves. And that has long been, that divide has always been there. And, the original Commerce Clause, under which a lot of these Supreme Court decisions were based on, we came in and we're like, well, we can do this based on the Commerce Clause. Well, the Commerce Clause says that, Congress can regulate commerce. It never said that it can aid commerce. And that's what has shifted to. And a lot of people, as Geoff said, well, that's a good idea. Why don't we aid, do all these things for industry? I think it was Albert J. Knox said that businessmen don't want a government that'll leave them alone. They want government they can use. And so that's what happened with these big industrial concerns. They basically got control of it. So, they used it to their effect. I think, switching gears for a minute, it's, imagine just a thought experiment with, instead of the federal government, is if they had the power to do this, as we've talked about, but had they chosen to, fund streetcars or sidewalks, rather than automotive infrastructure, what kind of built environment will we have today? Be completely different. It's my contingent that, sprawl as we know it, this kind of disturbanism that we continue to perpetuate, would not have been possible without federal involvement.
Yeah.
And so, the real kind of antidote it would be almost impossible to swallow is just stop it. Stop funding it.
So I can think about I can kind of think about two different kinds of infrastructure as we talk about this issue, and I wondered if we could help clarify this a little bit. So there's one type of infrastructure that provides for long distance travel between places. So whether historically that was waterways, railroads, roadways, I think in many of the initial roadways, you can fill in all the gaps in my history, but they were largely turnpikes that were private, that people paid to use, or I'm sure there were other methods, but that was certainly common, that there were a lot of privately built long-distance roadways. But then there's the infrastructure of a city or a town that is all of the streets and roadways, the water, the sewer, electrical, whatever it might be, so that larger infrastructure that goes city to city today, we typically finance and pay for through federal or state funds. And the infrastructure of a city is then some combination of local, state, and federal funds, but primarily local, with property tax, sales tax, whatever it might be, that goes into a big pool and then finances the build out, the repair, the maintenance of all that infrastructure. So today we kind of just generally accept that we pay into a pool of money for that city or town infrastructure, and then the city government, county government makes the decisions on how to deal with it. How might that have been different in the past compared to how we do it now? And I think about, so I had my time in Savannah, Georgia, which, had lots and lots of brick streets, or what people call cobblestone streets, but really just some variety of kind of brick or stone streets, a lot of dirt streets, streetcars even running down a lot of dirt streets in many cases. How might it have been different how that was built, paid for, or maintained?
Well, at the kind of short haul, just in a city situation like Savannah or Charleston or most cities, it was maintained by the locality. The citizens were taxed to maintain it, or they charged user fees in some form or fashion. We talked about the streetcars. The streetcar systems were privately run and operated. They had franchise agreements with cities. So just like the utility companies do today to use the street rights of way to run utility lines, the private streetcar systems had the same kind of franchise agreements. The longer haul stuff, you mentioned, Kevin, the turnpikes and things, canals were an especially big thing until the railroads came along and kind of, to a large extent, displaced those. But the rails were private companies too, and they had to go in, and sometimes they would get state grants or grants from the locality, but it wasn't the federal government that was involved in any way to do that. And so typically they would have to go in and acquire the right of way and buy it and then build the track between the cities.
That's how it was supposed to happen, but there was certainly some I don't know if you call it graft, or there's some bad behavior with regard to railroads, condemning land or gaining land through, they weren't always well behaved about that.
Yeah, well, there's always bad behavior and corruption that happens, but it was limited,
right.
And you had people, when you went to to market and saw Mayor Kevin walking by, you're like, hey, what's up with that decision you made about this or that? There was a lot more vigilance about the local infrastructure and the responsibility for it. But when that responsibility could be offloaded, that's what happened. And so,
yeah. a politician now will brag, a local politician will brag about how many federal dollars they got brought to their community. They are less likely to brag nowadays about how efficiently they have been spending the dollars under their care. Whereas if all of your infrastructure is your, your neighborhood streets, your parks, your street, whatever those things, like those are your dollars. That you, the kind of the notion of subsidiarity sort of kind of create it assures us there will be checks there, that people will be vigilant.
Have you ever had a chance to look at, like, imagine you were a land developer in, say, the 1870s, 1880s, and you had a 20-acre piece of land that was a town expansion of whatever town you're in, how that might have been undertaken, like what the process behind that was versus, obviously today we have a very involved, very lengthy process. We've kind of come back to the scenario now where developers basically pay for all the infrastructure for a new extension of a community, at least initially pay for it, and then it's deeded over to city government in many cases. Not all the infrastructure, but often the streets and sidewalks. How might that have been different if I was if I had 20 acres of land and I was extending Charleston in that era?
Well, you would have typically just gone and bought the land, and remember, you weren't putting in water lines and sewer lines until later in the 19th century. You were just cutting the trees down and calling what was a dirt road a street, and then you started to sell lots. I mean, that's really how Charleston grew, for the most of its history. The initial city plan was laid out by the British Lords Proprietors in 1680, and they served as the developer, and they came and cut these initial streets, and then private developers just kind of would extend it in the manner I said, just by buying the land and connecting to the existing street network. But it was very incremental, and they could only do a little bit at a time. 20 acres would have been huge for a developer in the 18th or 19th century.
Yeah.
What was the motivation for that developer to seek to be annexed by the town? The town they provided some degree of police protection. They had an ability to tax, like infrastructure, that could help them tax if the government was if the city was well run. It would increase the confidence of buyers to be under that municipality. But there probably
may have been some fire protection.
Could be, maybe, if that. But it was probably, my guess, I'm guessing here, is that the property taxes themselves, city-related taxes, were relatively nominal. The services were nominal but important. And the developer would want his buyers to have the confidence that the basic services that have been provided to those that live in the city right next to them would want to have that as well. And the developer would have to make the argument to the municipality that it's in the best interest of the existing citizens to incorporate and bring them in. Which is, not unlike how it happens now. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
that's probably, sure. Is that, I'm totally speculating, but is that about how it would go down?
Yeah, I would say.
Thinking about Ansonborough, when did Ansonborough start, Charleston?
That would have been in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s. Yeah, that was a very early suburb, and it was immediately the city was in 1790 was 400 acres, and was the fourth largest city in the country at that time, after New York and Boston and Philadelphia. So, yeah, I'm not sure how big Ansborough is, 30 or 40 acres, but that's what the developer did. He bought the land next door, started subdividing the lots, and then the city just said, okay, well, we'll take you in.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting history to like I live in Ansley Park in Atlanta, which was one of our like 1912. And it would be interesting to go back and look at the discussions between Ansley and the city of Atlanta about, like, hey, what's our relationship going to be here now? Because it had been farmland, unincorporated farmland prior to that.
Yeah, and I don't know, Geoff, you may not know this history. I don't know if we've talked about it, but for the benefit of Kevin's listeners, we named Ion after Jacob Bond Ion, who was a former owner of the property, and he was a highly regarded citizen who served, among other things, as president of the South Carolina Senate in the 1820s. And he lived in Charleston for much of his life. And in 1849, he was appointed at the head of a 73-man committee to study annexing all these suburbs north of what was then Boundary Street, now Calhoun Street, including the neighborhood that I live in, Elliottboro, which is about 4 or 5 blocks north of Calhoun Street. And they went into they studied it for a year, on whether or not to annex this property. Did it make sense financially for the city? How are they going to change the representation? Are we going to add new city council members, how many people will represent, how this will change it. But they really studied it into the ground. And at the time, to annex property to incorporate land, you had to get the states, you'd have to get the General Assembly to endorse that. So that's what they did. They recommended annexation, and all that land, Geoff, north of Calhoun Street to the city boundary, was annexed, effectively doubling the land area of the city. But they did it after much consideration, and which they had to do because the state wasn't going to come in and pay for their street, paving or what have you.
Yeah, they were scrutinizing it's kind of the same thing as scrutinizing a personal investment. Like, should I make this investment or not? Will it be good for us?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into a little bit, one of the things that I've thought about. So I live in a city that is a very large city geographically, over 300 square miles, and about 500,000 people. And like a lot of large cities, we struggle and fight and squabble about infrastructure constantly. And when you start to do the math, we're tremendously underwater financially on our infrastructure. And one of the things that I've kind of wondered as we've talked about, like thinking about other ways that things could be done, that or at least had some responsiveness to economics. And one of the things that I've wondered is, would it, even for a very large city like this, wouldn't it just be better if we had essentially smaller, localized districts that were much more responsive to a much smaller geography within a large city? So instead of like the entire 300 square miles having to bear the weight and decision of things that happen in a place you may not even ever know as part of your city, that at some level of a district or whatever, that there's almost like a infrastructure district that is charged with the ownership, the financing, the maintenance, the repair of all the public infrastructure in that area. I don't know there are places that do things like this. I know in the state of Nebraska, they have special service districts for infrastructure that are much smaller than like a whole city. I think that's common in some other states, but it's certainly not where I live. And I don't know if you've seen anything like that or had that discussion.
I haven't seen it with regard to infrastructure. There's certainly decisions that are made at the local neighborhood level here in Charleston, or they're made at the city council level, but the city council relies heavily on the local neighborhoods feel. But I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
I mean, to your intuition, I think if I can say that back to you and how I'm hearing it, you're suggesting that, like, you're asking the question, like, okay, like, this is the city's underwater on its infrastructure, and it's a big problem. Many cities, maybe the vast majority of cities, are in a similar place nowadays. This is different than where they were 100, 150 years ago, but it's a big problem, and a way that we might begin to solve the problem is by breaking it down into much smaller districts and having those districts attend to their problems there. Is that a fair sort of, you're hypothesizing?
Yeah, it is.
And I would say, like, I mean, to me, the most obvious way to solve the biggest problems is to break them down into very small problems and tackle them one by one. Like, a thing that I'm really encouraged about, this is a big problem. It's systemic. It will take a long time to solve it. We've been investing in a certain direction for a long, long time. Like, those are daunting, scary, painful realities to address, and they've caused a lot of problems. So I imagine most of your listeners will look at our built environment, probably agree with me. Whether or not they agree with my take on how it ought to be solved, they'll probably agree, like, hey, what we have right now is not good. Many Americans wouldn't agree with that, and I think those are good discussions to have with them about, like, how should it be. But regardless, a thing that I'm really encouraged about is recognition that there is a problem, which is growing. If it's not mainstream now, it might be approaching mainstream, but it certainly was not 20 years ago. Certainly was not 30 years ago. But recognition that it is a problem, beginning to intuit is I think, when you queued up this episode to begin with, like, hey, this is there's the aesthetics of it is like, we can sense this problem. There's these social reasons why the way we're building places are making us less healthy as communities and individuals. Like, that's, you see that aesthetically, you can immediately know that there are better ways to do it. But there's also a sense, I think a broadening sense, as you outlined, Kevin, at the beginning, that there's something underneath this. There's financial or systemic things that are affecting this that we need to change. And my view is that the solution is going to be we don't have the solution figured out, but the way to the solution is to do exactly what you just said. And it's to break the problem down into much smaller sizes.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this discussion before, kind of relative to centralization versus decentralization of problems. And I think a lot of this infrastructure problem, especially at the city government level, becomes very abstract for most people, because it's such a huge problem and the numbers are enormous. And it also ties into so much of the conversation, the YIMBY, NIMBY, conversation, because people at the local level may or may not see a benefit to approving a development in an area or being concerned about what anything is like. But it seems like if you could break that infrastructure dynamic down to a somewhat more, you can't make it too small, that's just, they don't function that way, but some smaller unit where people had a direct understanding of, here's the inputs, here's the outputs, and here's why we need to generate revenue. What's the mismatch? On a smaller level, you might have more interest and support for a different pattern of development that is a little more true to the historical pattern, because there's more of a direct relationship and understanding of how things actually work financially or don't work.
I agree with your sort of, I share your intuition that would be the case. We haven't talked about it much in here, but I'd add something in here in terms of the spending other people's money kind of thing. we're what is I I think there's plenty of disagreement, and there's going to be disagreement for a long time because there's been disagreement since the founding of the nation about what the federal government's role should be in funding infrastructure. Like that does, there's the Hamiltonians and then there's the Jeffersonians, and it's taken a lot of different shapes since then. It's pretty clear where Vince and I would fall on that side. Like we don't want the feds involved with it at all. But even if you just say you can't come to an agreement on that, can we come to an agreement that we should not debt finance money-losing infrastructure? We should not expand our public debt and lay a burden on a future declining population to pay for infrastructure so that we can use it today. Can we just agree on that? Like, can we agree that we shouldn't be doing that? If that happened, that would be bringing a degree of localism back to our decision making, because then it would be more local, because it would be the people spending money today are the people paying for the money today. Even if we're taking money from someone in Washington or Washington State, spending it on someone in Florida, at least they're all people living today. The way it's happening now is we are taking money from our grandchildren and spending it today. Like it's the most, they have no consent. There's no voice that they have in this infrastructure spending. And my sense is that as much as I want to bring these decisions back to the most reasonably local level, which would mean to me some made on a state level and some made on a county and some made on a municipal level, and it'd be reasonable. You could go and have a chance of seeing in the grocery store or wherever someone who's made these decisions and give them a piece of your mind. Like, as much as I would like that, I would really like us to just stop spending the money of our children who are not yet born to fund it. Like, that would be a start. That would be a start of making it a little more local. And you can express that. I mean, these are hard money kind of arguments, but I think a great many of the challenges we have today result from us spending the money of people who are not yet born. Yeah. And I think I'm very heartened by kind of Gen Z's view on this thing. I think for obvious reasons, they're more attuned. There are members of Gen Z that are more attuned to this issue than people in my generation at their age were. And with a looming decline in population and questionable return on investments for public spending, I think hopefully there'll be more scrutiny on this. And, well, there is more scrutiny. So, and the machine keeps going on along as it is, but it can't do that forever. And hopefully it will be pulled back through the will of the people rather than being forced by the inignorable gravity of economics.
Yeah, I think I can't disagree with any of that. I think that's it. If we could get to that point where we could agree on some of those foundations, it'd be an incredible leap from where we are now. Vince, I think I want to give you the last word here. I know in a certain sense, we've just scratched the surface on this topic, and especially where we were and where we are now. But I wonder if you have some final thoughts about where we might put our heads towards, as we look at the problem today and going forward.
Well, I'll start by just echoing what has been said. Geoff said, and Kevin, you may have said it too, that the awareness, as in so many things, is the first step. So just to be aware and to acknowledge the problem is very important. The old, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. First, you have to find yourself. But there is so much, as Geoff noted, there's so much more awareness. You know, even in the last 5 or 10 years, even since I can't remember the last time we saw each other. It was when you were still living in Savannah. And it's especially the case, you know, since Newpoint was started in 1991 or first conceived. So, and it's about in all these things of the built environment, not just the architecture and the urbanism, but you know, just what this kind of system has done to us culturally, politically, the polarization. There's people are just saying, "Hey, there's got to be more than this." And I think that this infrastructure, this built environment that we have, has a huge impact on culture and politics and everything else. So we got to tie these things together, and understand them and how they affect what effects have on the long run.
Well, Vince and Geoff, I really appreciate you both taking the time today. It's been a lot of fun. I think we'll probably continue this at some point in the future. Geoff might make for another few Yeoman podcasts as well.
Let's do it. I love that. I love the idea of that. Kevin, thanks a lot for having us.
Absolutely. I would suggest everybody also subscribe to the Yeoman podcast, and Geoff has a really unique set of guests as well that I think provides a whole different take than you're going to hear in a lot of the urbanism world or new urbanism world. So I always really enjoy it, and then hopefully, Vince, where are you active these days? What are you up to besides living in Charleston? And I assume you're still building beautiful stuff.
Well, trying to, yeah. It's mostly focused on small infill projects and downtown Charleston. We have our eyes on some big prizes, but for now we're just hitting singles. So and enjoying that.
Well, there's a lot of championships won by hitting singles. So
that's right.
That's a great way to go as well. All right. Thank you both so much. I appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
You're welcome. My thanks to you for having us. See you.